Hello, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's presentations of Life After COVID. We're at the end of our fourth week this week. I can't believe it's gone by so fast, and we're really pleased to welcome with us this afternoon Dr. Claudine Farrell. Dr. Farrell is a professor of history, and she's also the chair of the History and American Studies Department. She's going to be speaking with us this afternoon, and the title is From History, How Americans Have Responded to Disasters. Just want to remind you all, before we get started with our presentation, that the Q&A is the function to, as you're listening to Dr. Farrell give her presentation, you think of a question, put it in the Q&A. The rest of the attendees can see it there and they can give it a thumbs up and vote it up. And if you have questions, you have of a technical nature, have a problem, to let the host know, we would use the chat for that. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Farrell, invite her to unmute her video. Here she is, and I'll turn it over to her.
Okay, thank you. Let's see what I can do here, get started, because I have a lot to share, as you might expect from a historian who covers a lot. And I'm going to be like Professor Marsh, and I am going to acknowledge right off the bat that I changed my title. The more I worked on this, the more I began rethinking, and I changed it to From God to Government in terms of who we want help from or who we blame. But then the more I worked on it, the more I changed it even more. So it's kind of from God to stars to vampires, believe it or not, to cold air to novels to foreigners to government, and the list could have gone on and on and on. And this I hope I will explain most of these in here. To start off, I do want to make a disclaimer, kind of in line with Professor McClurkin did. He talked about all of the areas of his expertise. I want to mention right off the bat a couple of mine that are not expertise areas. I'm not a medical doctor and I'm not a medical historian. I am a historian, though, of American history, African American history, legal, constitutional, who is increasingly over about the last 10 years delved into American disasters, everything from dam collapses to plane crashes to disease. And that's kind of the source of my interest in talking today about things in our past related to COVID. I do want to throw in this other disclaimer. History is strewn with the carcasses of discarded ideas once embraced as truth. And this I'm talking about not just the people of the times, the 1790s, the 1860s, but the medical people. Maybe we wouldn't even see them as very medically trained or thinking from their time period, but not just the historians, but these people. And we're going to be looking at a lot of these confusing ideas that have got us to where we are now, to actually being able to create COVID vaccines in an unbelievably short amount of time, and to be struggling with what to do with the economy and what to do with our schools. All of this has roots in the past. And I want to look at some ideas brought to us by Professor Howard Markle, who is a medical historian. Society's understandings of how a disease travels, and that could be literally from person to person, but also as that person moves by stagecoach, by river, by canal, by ocean liner, and increasingly now, of course, by air travel. That affects how we panic or don't panic, feel confident, and how we try to stop progression. Also, diseases have obviously economic impact on us. It eliminates workers. It affects what businesses can produce and sell. And that, of course, as we've seen, particularly in the last year, has affected how we have decided, let's do or don't do this in response to a disease because of the economic impact, trying to balance them. The movement of people, which I already mentioned, and the speed of travel. So the disease travels and infects either directly from person to person or some entity, a mosquito, as we'll see. But then the people who maybe can be contagious spread it, or they take the mosquitoes with them. I mean, certainly that has happened. Media coverage, not new today. Social media, yes. But newspapers, posters, circulars, those things have been around for centuries. And those have either reassured or attempted to reassure or provide solutions, whether those solutions really exist. Countries, not just China, countries have frequently hidden news about an epidemic. In the United States, certainly, I don't know if you would say hid it, but certainly did not discuss it. President Woodrow Wilson said nothing, absolutely nothing publicly about the 1918 flu that killed close to 700,000 Americans. Okay. That, as a result, sometimes does not allow actions to stop the spread and actually then winds up encouraging the spread. Westerners, in particular, have a tendency to blame others, outsiders, Russia, China, Africa, Central America, the Caribbean. We have a tendency to do that, and I'm talking broadly over time. And that leads to actions that hurt those people without necessarily being of any use in stopping the spread of the epidemic. So I want to go to Professor Markle again. Although historians by nature are hesitant to predict the future, Professor McClurkin talked about this, I feel quite comfortable in suggesting that most of what I just listed on the previous page will again be part of whatever emerging infectious disease we face in years to come. And I can't quite tell you how they're going to mix, but I do think history provides us with many of these kind of, maybe not answers, but things to think about. And you go, okay, this is him coming up with COVID. No, this was him in 2007. So in effect, I think it would be useful for our students today to be thinking about, is this something that you would still apply to today? Did we really do what he said he thought we would be able to do? Now, what I have here, and this is also to provoke some thinking, these are some of the things that have changed over the course of, let's say, for the United States, the last couple of hundred years in response to certain epidemics and diseases. And I'm certainly not saying that using porches or opening windows is totally the result of that, or taking carpet out of your bathroom or putting a powder room on the first floor comes directly, exclusively from that. But these are things that people started thinking about in relation to things maybe they were already thinking about and they were spurred. And you can look at some of these, this came from an architectural article, some of the things that you have probably already thought about in relation to learning something from COVID. Home offices becoming people's main offices, being concerned about technology, internet connection, finding a way to connect indoor and outdoor space and make that space more flexible and usable for the kids studying online, for somebody writing a blog, for somebody doing work reports. How do you make the space more family friendly, but also work friendly? And a lot of ideas have come out of this recently. That's not saying these ideas didn't exist before that, but they have certainly been spurred on. And the idea of hand washing, of course, I have washed my hands more in the last year than probably the rest of my life combined, or so it feels. And I'm going to continue to do that. I did not get a cold this year. I did not get flu. And I am going to be continuing to wear a mask. I'm like probably 40% of the country that's probably going to be wearing a mask a lot more than I really need to, but it feels safer and it feels more comfortable. So what I'm going to be talking mainly about today are these 6 viruses and bacteria. I am not going to spend equal time with all of them because I'll never get done. Whoops. But I do want, to point out that these tiny little things, bacteria or virus, are what have killed millions and millions of people over time. And by the way, they're stained in different colors, so they don't necessarily match up with what you think they might look like. These are some of the ways that people have responded to those diseases caused by those virus and bacteria, but also caused by airplane crashes and caused by dam collapses, fires, whatever. They have prayed for help from God. They have offered God, in effect, a deal. We'll be closer to you. We'll lead a better life if you don't send the next plague or whatever. We have aided each other, sometimes just family, sometimes in our community broader. People have left. They have left during disasters and they have left after disasters. I'm not going through that again. We have improved our responses. I often think about outward opening doors in buildings, tie downs from mobile homes, the victims of so many tornadoes, lights and signals at railroad crossings. We have ways of better understanding the power of tornadoes, earthquakes, hurricanes. We have insurance that covers us in ways that it never did before. You might want to just think specifically about flood insurance. We have ways on the national level of responding, because most of what I'm going to be talking about is pre-1950, pre-1979. So we don't have basically a federal government response to any of it. That wasn't its job. And people would basically never have thought of it. We're going to go to Congress, which is what it would have been. Why? That's not its job. Our local government, our state government is where we need to go to for help. A lot of people respond to disasters throughout history, and certainly we hear it today, by saying, well, that was a 100-year flood, and so it's not going to happen again for another 100 years. And of course, that's not what 100-year, 500-year, 1,000-year flood means. It means percentage of chance that it would occur in each individual year. So it could happen year after year after year after year. It's only a 1% chance, so the odds aren't that it will, but it could. We have a tendency, like I said before, Professor Markle mentioned, of blaming others. And we also have a tendency, and this is throughout time, of saying, let's just get back to normal. Let's just get back to normal. And what Professor Markle has said is, we're relieved. We don't want to think about that stuff anymore. We're tired. We're worn out. We're stressed. We want to go on with our lives. We also have consider, in some cases, monuments. So this is something I think has been brought out a little bit, and certainly Professor Delancey has brought out some of the artists' ways of dealing with history and dealing with our lives. Monuments to COVID victims. We generally think of monuments as we just had Memorial Day, to soldiers and airmen and sailors and first responders of all types who, thank you, people. I appreciate it. I'm from a military family. I appreciate it, every day of my life. But what do we do with something like a disease where you don't make a choice to get sick and survive it or whatever? New Zealand, I think, is a good example. New Zealand was hit very hard by the flu in the fall of 1918, as this indicates. It had a population of 1 million, but it lost 9,000 people in 6 weeks. It lost only 18,000 in 4 years of the World War, which was just ending. They refer to this as Black November. And you can look at this monument that was just dedicated a couple of years ago. This disaster shaped modern approaches to managing infectious diseases, helping to protect future generations. Is that what happened there? If you take that 6 weeks and the population change, what would the number of deaths be equivalent today? Is 45,000. So I would say, how many people has New Zealand lost to COVID? Let's see, it's lost 26. So that's 26 in a year and a half versus 9,000. Gives you some idea. This is the only U.S. memorial that I know of, and I just finished researching it again, to the 1918 flu pandemic, which cost about 700,000 American lives. And this man commissioned it because he found out his grandfather had died in 1918. We have this grove in San Francisco for AIDS, and it might be something, if you keep these points in mind, that might relate to what we want to do with COVID. There is an architectural design for this. I still have not figured out how people are not going to get washed away or fall down that thing. But this is one idea. Why it would be in Uruguay, I don't know that either. I've done some checking and I haven't found it yet. But let's shift over to something more American history right now. And what you have here are some of the disasters. And this is very deceptive because yellow fever, it's in mid to late 1800s. This is over and over and over throughout the country. Smallpox, I have it 1520. Spaniards arrive. This devastates for decades. The Incas, the Aztecs in North America. It is horrific. They had no immunity to smallpox. What I want to add is scientists, medical people discover bacteria in the 1660s. But okay, now what do you do with it? Viruses are found in the 1890s. We don't get antibiotics until essentially the World War II period. So if you've got something that can be treated with antibiotics, but you don't even have antibiotics, of what good is it going to do? So you've got some real issues of not just figuring out what is making people sick and how to treat them, but how to prevent them from getting ill or maybe eliminating that disease in total. And just to emphasize my point about the repetition of this, let me go back to this. This is New York for about 150 years. And you'll notice there's yellow fever over and over and over. There's cholera over and over and over. There's smallpox. There's influenza finally in 1920, but it hit before that. You don't have, there's a polio epidemic right in here. You don't have that. So there's things you don't have, but look what you do have. You have an effort to get more water and clean water that can help take care of cholera in the long term. You have a board of health and a health department. It depends on who's in charge, and that's not going to be a particular use in 1918, but at least you have the beginnings. You have other efforts to fix particular narrow problems that you see as the issue. Okay, this is going to take us into smallpox. There is a British TV show called, it's a satire on British cop shows, A Touch of Cloth. And I had it on in background as I was working on this presentation, and I caught this line: some things are best left in the past, like smallpox and the Macarena. And I was horrified. I was impressed that they mentioned smallpox because it has been eliminated from the world. But they put it in the same sentence in a comparison with the Macarena. And those of you who are probably less than 35 years old, maybe, may not know the Macarena, but it was one of those songs that you heard all the time, and there was a little dance thing that went with it, and it finally drove everybody crazy. And if this works, I'll let you know. Macarena, que tu cuerpo pa' dar la alegría y cosas buenas. Hala tu cuerpo, alegría, Macarena. Macarena. Hala tu cuerpo, alegría, Macarena, que tu cuerpo pa' dar la alegría y cosas buenas. So it's catchy, but it can drive you crazy. They put that with smallpox. Smallpox has killed, crippled, or disfigured, and blindness was very common. 1/10 of all humanity. About 1/3 of the people who get it die. And at the turn of the 20th century, it was still in major parts of the world. This is smallpox. These people are going to be permanently scarred. This poor lady's going to die. She's dying here. This is what smallpox does, and this is what has saved us from it. I don't know what that's saying. I don't know if y'all can see that. Here are some of the major world leaders who got smallpox and survived. Here are major world leaders, and look at the timing over and over in this time period, who did not survive. These gods from different cultures, different times of the world, different parts of the world, either were related to smallpox because, what's bringing this, or prayed to them to save us from smallpox. But smallpox was more manageable than a lot of things. And this just gives you some idea of what it is. It infects only humans versus COVID, which we now know has affected or been found in at least 12 animals, species. By the way, I can name them. I've worked on that. It's contagious in a kind of known you are infected way. It also had, we developed that vaccine that does not require refrigeration. And you may go, what's the big deal? I think over the last year, we know because in developing a vaccine for for COVID, uh, how it can be protected and maintained and transported has been very, very important. And so as of 1918, the World Health Organization has declared smallpox eliminated from the world. There are still toxins that are kept by the CDC as well as Russia, just in case it is needed for responding to some sort of uh, bioterrorism. I always look at this sign and think that should be in my backyard, but obviously it's a sign in a community that says in general there are a lot of mosquitoes. So what we're shifting to here is yellow fever. And yellow fever devastated American cities, devastated countries around the world, and in fact still does. The jaundice it causes people's eyes and skin to turn yellow. And you can see here the severity of some of the illnesses. And I thought if we can get this, you would find this pretty useful. This is Philadelphia.
The first stage of disease, that they might be very tired, very nauseous, vomiting, have severe muscle aches, joint pains, feel like their bones are breaking. Their eyes might be bloodshot, and they might be suffering from a very severe headache, which is made worse by the light and noise. For most of these people, they will enter a period of remission. They'll get better. Most of their symptoms will go away. For about 15% of these people, though, once they're starting to feel better, they will suddenly take a turn for the worse. During this point, fevers rise again, often to 105, 106 degrees Fahrenheit. Patients are often writhing in pain on bed, vomiting what's known as black vomit, and that's because of bleeding that occurs inside of the stomach due to the liver failure. You can bleed from pretty much any orifice. You can bleed from your mouth, you can bleed from any abrasions or holes that have been poked in your body from bloodletting, can also start to bleed profusely as well. At this point also, the kidneys can shut down. The patient can stop making any urine at all. Because of this, the toxins build up in the body and can affect the way the brain works. This is one of the most horrific parts of the disease. So you'll see people who are anywhere from just a little bit irritable or having some problems with their memory to folks on the other end of the spectrum who are delirious, screaming, pulling their clothes off, running out into the streets. Yellow fever is one of the most terrifying diseases we've seen in our history.
And that is part of what drove Philadelphians, those who were wealthy enough to leave. And I go, back to that earlier response. There are people who left Philadelphia and probably never came back. Others that that left and did come back. And this is going to spread to New York. They tried to quarantine so that way, Philadelphia couldn't infect them, but this is going to affect New York. It's going to affect other places. And much of the response to it was this heroic medicine inherited from the Greeks and others of seeing the body. How in the heck does the body even function? And what is making people sick? Well, there's some imbalance to it. And that imbalance involves these four humors: blood, black bile, whatever, nobody quite knows what that is, yellow bile, and phlegm. And so you may have to bleed somebody, which, by the way, killed a fair number of people, or super warm them or give them certain kind of enemas or whatever, but you got to change the body in order to make it start functioning well again. And obviously it didn't work, and the deaths were horrific. And one explanation, well, then how do we live with this? I mean, this was the capital of the US at this time. And in effect, the US government shut down as a result of this. They couldn't function. But what do you do afterwards? Well, you look ahead. You forget what you have to forget and you move on. But this gloomy knowledge that the plague was now part, and by plague, it's like any of these epidemic diseases, was now part of American life. This was not new. The yellow fever had hit before. This wasn't new, but this was a brand new country, and this was the capital. And then it moves to New York and other places. So this is devastating. And you can see from this map, and look at these dates, 1600s, 1800s. We go down to Florida. We go down now into Texas. We go up the Mississippi, not just down it, but up it in these periods. New Orleans into the early 1900s. And this is 1888. This is yellow fever trying to kill Florida and destroy trade. And here's Columbia, the kind of female version of Uncle Sam, trying to get help. This is devastating. This led to ships not being able to dock in New Orleans. It led to ships from New Orleans not being allowed to go up the Mississippi. We're not even going to let you come in. And the U.S. Doesn't have a public health service at this time. It has its Marine Hospital Service, and it tries to stop some travelers. But the problem is, as a historian said in the 1940s, a disease which clearly was not transmitted directly from person to person. They could see that, but which nevertheless spread from one place to another with humans. What's causing this? What's going on here? Well, here's part of what they tried to do. Okay, if it's coming with you, we don't want you to come in. You're not coming down this road. You're not getting off this train. You're not doing it. But Walter Reed and his medical corps, some of whom gave their lives in the test to find out what was going on, did find out that it was the mosquito. And so now New Orleans, for example, is getting into fumigating. It's getting into making sure there's no standing water, that the water is held in containers that will not let it drip out and provide homes for mosquitoes. They get rid of these open water drains here, and they build a whole new canal water system. And so it controls it. We also developed a vaccine. It's, toward the end of even the Great Depression. And this indicates some of the parts of the world where yellow fever is still a major issue. If you travel internationally, as my brother did in the military, you're going to have a whole series of injections as you go your way. Now, I did assign a video on polio because polio is something that ended just as I was, coming into the world, and I did not feel this. This was before my time, but I do have the dimes because you are talking about an effort related to that. But polio frightened parents more than any other disease. And I was stunned by this. 1954, heart of the Cold War. Number one worry, nuclear annihilation. Number two, polio. That gives you some idea. And since polio struck so heavily into young people, into children, it was something that obviously any parent fears just centered around, particularly since it struck mainly in the warm summer months, because if you go down here, viruses spread by nasal and oral secretions in contact with contaminated feces. So if you don't clean up and you go out and you touch toys and you're outside in sandboxes and swings and whatever, it's so much easier to pick up something. Now, most of the people who got polio, very mild, no symptoms or recovery. People got sick, as one of the girls in one of the videos did, and she got better. Her muscles, the neurons survived this and restored themselves. But that didn't happen. It didn't happen to a boy in one of my classes. He had, as this little girl does, the metal braces and the metal crutches. He was not one of the ones who spent their lives, decades, in an iron lung that made the chest muscles move to make the lungs move. There were those who believed you could save the muscles by, limiting movement. There were others who argued, no, you need warm, wet compresses and kind of keep the muscles functioning. So there were a lot of different theories, but it was frightening. But what they started in the late 1930s, in part due to Franklin Roosevelt, who obviously had polio, was to collect money from the American people. I think the equivalent they got in 1954 would be today something short of $1 billion. This is what people contributed. And it was an effort to reach everybody. Hollywood stars, Clark Gable, Bob Hope, Katharine Hepburn, all made videos that they showed in films. And they went, they tried to reach the children.
We're bound to win with a heart. We'll make polio with knives and quarters and our dollars home.
It goes on a little bit more, but you get the idea, using Disney characters for this. And the result was with the Salk and the Sabin vaccines, polio largely as a killer disappeared in the United States. And here you see a scene, people lined up. They did not wait to find out whether this vaccine, whatever one, was going to work or not. And there's some children and there are others who died from the vaccine, from mistakes made. But parents, it was like, we've got to save our children. It was that drastic. And to give you the best example of that is Dr. Sabin needed more people to test on, to try his vaccine on. And this is in 1959, I believe. I mean, one of the scariest parts of the Cold War. He got permission from the Soviet Union to test his vaccine on children in the Soviet Union. And he tested it on 10 million of them. And he was finally awarded with a special medal and all of that from them because of the importance of saving their children's lives. Sadly, here you might see these are white children lined up separately from black children. Okay. And polio is largely eliminated. Look what happened in just 20 years. And what you have here are just a couple of parts of the world that are struggling for various reasons with eliminating the remainder of it. I need to zip through this because I'm going to take forever. Phthisis or phthisis, white plague, consumption. We are talking about tuberculosis. And I'm going to skip over one thing here. The bacteria for it was discovered in the late 1800s. So at least by then they knew it wasn't kind of hereditary or accidental or something about a predisposition. The problem though is how do you keep the people alive until you can find a way to prevent it or treat it? And they did come up. And there are a variety of medications now for that. But in the meantime, in the 1800s, it killed a lot of people. It killed tens and hundreds of thousands of people over the entire century and over the centuries before that. This is a painting by Thomas Girton. He, I think, died when he was 27. An interesting angle, and I just want to bring this up, is female beauty in the 1800s included all of these things. But weirdly, so did tuberculosis, led to many of these. And if you're going to die of something, this seemed a little bit better, I guess. But female beauty and this illness kind of went in sync. They kind of matched each other. And I love this comment that came from one historian. Coughing, emaciation, relentless diarrhea, fever, phlegm, became a sign of beauty in women, but also, this horrible disease. So you had these women who have these long necks and fair skinned and rosy cheeks and red lips. Well, that kind of matched in the stooped shoulders. It's a strange situation, and I can't show you a book, but there's a book right now called Consumptive Chic, and it's all about how these things matched up. But here's another case where there were results of shortening dresses because, oh my gosh, it's pulling up, things that are causing disease. This is, by the way, the disease where people thought vampires were involved because the victims look so vampire-ish, especially when they start coughing up blood. And so there were families that were convinced to dig up the bodies of their dead children or whatever and take the heart out. scatter the bones, do whatever to try to stop the vampires. One of the solutions was a lot of these sanitariums. This gives you an idea of the size of the effort to try to deal with all the people that were sick. Need fresh air. Here's an example of somebody needing fresh air, and the family tried to improvise something. It drove a lot of people to the West because that's where you were going to get fresh air, cool, you would get some healthy outdoor labor, and it helped settle the West. You have efforts to stop the spread once they figured out what it is. They didn't have a treatment or a cure for it. And this one in particular might ring familiar for COVID. This was also the beginnings of what became the American Lung Association and Christmas seals, which some of you may be familiar with. And I have a promotional thing there, but I'm not going to play it because I'm going to run too long. But it was another effort that was raised by, Americans. And by the way, Salk and Sabin, as indicated in the video, they did not patent their polio vaccines. It was in effect their gift, their donation to the world. And you have that kind of thinking going on. So this is tuberculosis today, and you can see that it still exists, but it's something stirred up again by AIDS. And I'm just going to zip through here. Cholera was associated very much with the poor and with the immigrants. And this is another horrifying disease that's going to lead to some pretty specific reforms. Explosive flesh vessels primed for viral spread, unrelenting vomiting, explosive rice water colored diarrhea, which made it hard to clean up and not spread it because you couldn't really tell it was there. Positively ghastly looking as they careen rapidly toward death. And in cholera spread in multiple epidemics in the United States, you can see from there. But I want to focus on this in particular because it took me a while to figure it out. I found some cities, and here were their death tolls in the 1849 cholera epidemic. There were really 32, 49, 66 were the major ones. And you go, well, that's not that bad considering, the size of these cities. Well, these are the size of the cities at this time. So Chicago was essentially the size of Fredericksburg. St. Louis was the size of Lynchburg. New Orleans and Cincinnati, if you put them together, about the size of Richmond. And New York is about the size of Fresno, California. And you go, oh, okay, well, that's a little different. And you go, well, but what was the losses? As of last night, these are our COVID losses. So imagine Fredericksburg getting hit with 3,500 deaths in just a couple of 3 months. So these were devastating. And so one of the solutions, because this cholera was not endemic, it was something that just popped up in these immigrant, often travel-fed epidemics. Okay, I just did this, sorry about that. And even the president finally get the national government call for a national day of fasting and humiliation, but they're still telling people to stay away from cold water. But what it is cholera was spread by untreated sewage that got into the water. And so if you did not clean up the water, which New York did in part by putting up this aqueduct, 40-mile-long gravity aqueduct. Okay, real fast, and I will be really fast. The way we looked and felt on that first flu case, they didn't know what it was. They tried all sorts of possibilities. They called it all sorts of different things, and they finally leveled on this because Spain wasn't in World War I, and it broadcast that it had the flu. This is the flu in kind of an accepted number of worldwide deaths. The United States has had, sorry about that, about 675 deaths at that time. I think it was higher, but that would equate to something short of 2 million today. This was like essentially 2 months. This was about 2 months when the main one hit. And if anybody wants to watch this again, they can, and they can see some of these comparisons that I tried to make some similarities and some differences without being thorough. But you do have conspiracy theories, incorrect explanations of how the weather would play a role. uneven responses on every level of society. National response was really none for the flu, and I would use the word constrained for COVID. We call it social distancing. They call it avoid crowds. It was something new. They just did not know what was being so horrific. People who were fine at 10 o'clock in the morning dropped dead at 5. Really almost no symptoms. It looked like the plague. It looked like the bubonic plague. It wasn't. There were issues of personal liberty versus medical and economic balancing. The flu did hit people mainly in the 20s and 30s, and I do want to show this. The flu generally has this U shape. It had a W shape. It really hit hard the people in these young adult parent working stages. And these are some of the, sorry, my mouse is new. Some of the victims, President Roosevelt, Mahatma Gandhi, Walt Disney, Amelia Earhart, all got the flu, all survived, thank goodness. This is Willard Hall and Mary Washington, and I did double check, and Virginia Gulrich was the chair of the history department at that time, and she was the only person at Mary Washington who died, and she died fairly quickly. And the flu could hit at that time very quickly, and you recover, and then you get hit by the pneumonia that often followed, or you can just linger and be fine, or it could hit just like instantaneously. And I think the reason that people have forgotten it to some extent until COVID is, look at these. These covers are all about the war. People were fighting a war, and Philadelphia refused to stop its bomb parade. And this is what happened. This is what happened. And this leads to this famous drawing. This is what happened to St. Louis because it responded before the flu really hit it. And this is what happened in Philadelphia, which responded after the flu hit it. And this ship is a perfect example. It sailed from New Zealand to Samoa. This is the American Samoa. It responded before ships got there with the flu and stopped them. Nobody died. This is what happened in Western Samoa that did not do that. About a quarter of the people died. Okay. People were told they couldn't even go into homes. I love this, and I will say this. We'll set lifesaver and face powder, men, barbershop, a lot of different reactions to wearing the flu, a lot of resentment about wearing the flu, even some physical violence. Some people were arrested. Businesses closed, businesses opened at different hours. Schools often did not close because they thought kids were safer there than maybe at home. People did a little bit of correspondence through regular mail, washing their hands, probably the death knell of kind of public spitting there. Lots of things closed, football games, theaters, billiard halls, saloons. You can look at this later on the replay if you want to, but this is kind of my following what happened in Richmond. And it pretty much parallels what we have today. The back and forth, and all of this, unlike today, happened in about 6 to 8 weeks. I do have some comparisons here of the flu and COVID, so you get some idea of the differences and some things that would make our response very different today. One thing economically, do keep in mind that the war had a kind of simultaneous impact, plus and minus, on employment and production. The flu did hit prime age workers, and then once the war was over, workers came back. And it was a very different economy. And I think the one that really strikes me is farming, fishing, and forestry, 15% of the population versus 0.3 today. So you really see some different economic indicators. And I tried to block out that the flu and the war hit pretty much at the same time on all of these indicators. So I will finish with Markle's statement. I do think history provides us with many thought-provoking, broad brush strokes with which to think about pandemics. Our issue is, what do we do with that? Thank you.
Wow, Thank you.
All I
Dr.
can think.
Claudine Farrell. I love all of the images that you've amassed here. I have to ask, how do you find all this stuff, all these things from popular media?
A lot of it is just basic Google searches, but there are
Okay.
a variety of schools and organizations that have done a lot of research, COVID inspired for that. But
Yeah.
also there
Okay.
are more and more studies in disaster histories. And so they mention something and I go find what they
Yeah,
mentioned.
right. Okay. Well, let's try to get started here with some Q&A. One of the first questions comes from an alum. Do you think, based on what you've seen in the past, do you think that that COVID is going to turn into something like the flu, where everybody just sort of gets their shot every fall, just kind of like what we do with the flu now?
I mean, that's what I have certainly picked up, that that it's going to be endemic. It's just going to be there, and it will appear some years more than others. What worries me is kind of like what happened. The flu in 1918 was H1N1, and that is a particularly dangerous one, as we've discovered. And it is, the flu every year is not always that. It's H different number, N different number. And so it has a different impact. And the trickiness is finding the right vaccine to match whichever flu comes out. And we're kind of doing that with COVID right now with the Delta variant that is supposed to be more contagious and more serious, and not necessarily going to be helpful for people who've had only one COVID vaccine, and not helpful for people who have already had COVID. So it's different. So my guess is, what little we know about COVID, it's probably going to be a version of the flu. I mean, in terms of its impact and spread and all that.
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Farrell. It's amazing to look at these historic parallels, and in particular, looking at the 1918 flu epidemic. Do you think that, given some of those historic parallels and then the current discussions we have about essential service workers, people that are in low hourly wage positions but in essential positions, do you think there will be greater appreciation for individuals serving in those positions? Did you see that after 1918?
Yeah, 1918 is just so unusual because of the war. We ran out of nurses because we need, Red Cross, we got to send them to Europe and take care of the soldiers. I mean, the war was just the most important thing, and everything that you did without, or everything that you went through, was part of your home front soldier role. This is what you had to do. And so I think it was just like, well, we all made sacrifices. That was it. That's it. We just made sacrifices because there's something bigger than the flu, bigger than my family. It's the war. We don't have that right now. It is COVID. That's it. How are you dealing with that? I know for me, I have certainly gained a much greater appreciation. Not because I need it. I go to Walmart late at night and I buy my kitty litter, my cat food, and my Diet Dr. Pepper and all of that. And I'm fine. And I can very much limit what I do. But the people with kids, the people with elderly neighbors that they help take care of, getting food, staying safe, and the people, the Uber drivers, and I have students who work in various food places, restaurants or fast food or grocery stores, and you can tell the sacrifice they're making. Yes, they have to make money, but they know that they are risking their health and the health of family and friends by being there. And they made me think about that over and over and over. So I hope other people are valuing what they do. And I think our effort to provide extended unemployment, our effort to provide delays or suspensions of various water bills and electric bills and mortgage payments and all of that, it's a little bit going to have a carryover, that we appreciate that not everybody can handle this stuff. I kept my job. I kept getting paid. It did not affect me. My sister lost her job. She's still unemployed. her son was unemployed for months and got his job back. So, we keep hearing these stories. I hope the stories we hear make us more sensitive to that. I'm not sure it will, because I do think we have a tendency to move on, back to normal. Remember what President Warren Harding said as he was running, senator, running for president, wanted a return to normalcy, a word he made up. But it wasn't a normalcy from sickness to health. It was just a normalcy and, kind of toned down our lives after the war and progressive reform. And I suspect we're going to have some version of that. I'm not sure how we're going to with the political divisions. Some of the things that Professor Farnsworth and Cooperman talked about on Tuesday will probably keep things a little bit more heated. Sorry, kept talking.
So continuing on, I've got a question about some comparisons with history about people who, as we've seen with COVID, who've either denied either the disease itself or the severity of the disease, and also who have been anti-vaccine. Have we seen that in other situations in the past?
I mean, you certainly saw it with the very beginnings of which would be the smallpox vaccine, because what we have learned is that for hundreds of years, different societies were taking smallpox pus from some of those pustules and in either, grounding it up and sniffing it or putting into a scrape or a cut in order to give themselves what they hope would be a milder case of smallpox and thus immunity from it. And that's what Jenner did in the, what was it, the late 1700s, early 1800s. And there was, that was pretty horrifying. And I thought, what would I have done if somebody said, okay, you have a child and we could give that child smallpox. And you know what smallpox does, but fingers crossed, it will be mild and it will not cause any, major pocking or anything like that. And some of them did get some pocking, but it was minor. And there were some people who died. But what Jenner did is he took the cowpox, which was a form of this disease, what was on cows, and it was much milder. And it turned out that that gave humans immunity from smallpox. Power to him for thinking about that. But there were people who were horrified, and I should have included it, but it's so familiar to anybody who studies this. But there's a painting from that time period of people getting vaccinated, because vaca, cow, vaccinated, and they have cow parts growing out of their bodies. They have a cow head coming out here and a cow foot coming out of their arm and a cow foot, because people were like, what in the heck are you doing? But there were people who, they were so desperate, kind of like with polio, they were so desperate to find a cure that they were willing to do that. But for a lot of them throughout the 1800s, it was like, what are you saying is going on with the body? This can't be. This makes no, a mosquito, go away, you crazy person. Let me go do something else. So there were a lot of people who rejected these ideas. Really good microscopes, really good testing, really good evidence finally started showing up enough to convince the medical field, which really developed differently in the 1800s to what it is now. But yeah, they were all over the place. And I know one of my colleagues, Professor Alison Posca, has done a fair amount of work, even talked to the CDC about vaccinations in opposition to vaccinations back in the, I think, 1600s, 1700s, early 1800s. So it is an issue to look at to understand some of the reactions today.
That actually ties in well with the next question, which is about what sort of lessons we could learn. But I want to modify it a little bit and ask you, as a historian, what are the history books going to say about this last year? 100 years from now, what are people going to be looking back saying, well, we learned a lesson there? What are they going to be talking about?
Okay. I wish I knew what we were going to know 5 years from now. That would really help me
Sure.
answer the question. If I knew 5 years from now what's happening, I'm fingers crossed for the rest of this year. And I'm probably like a lot of people. When I got my first vaccine, I felt really good, and I got my second vaccine, and I felt like some of the weight of the world was off. I mean, it really felt good. I remember pumping my fist when I got in the car. Yes, got that. But I don't know what's going to happen with the people who have not gotten vaccinated and what impact. And it may turn out that what's been done and what's going to be done just by 60-70% of the population, and what happens with the variants is going to make a difference. But we got the rest of the world to deal with too. And as we saw with some of the charts, just because the US deals with something doesn't mean that it's gone from the rest of the world, and the rest of the world will not infect other parts of the world. I don't want to make us the center of everything, but I mean, what's happening in India is horrible. What's happened in some of the Latin American countries, South American countries is horrible. You can't pull off what New Zealand pulled off. I have an idea we're going to remember it in some way similar to the 1918 flu. We botched a lot of things. We tried to do a lot of things. We didn't do enough. What are we now? Right, slightly over 600,000 people dead. I keep looking at the numbers because I wanted to update the numbers on that one slide, comparing it to cholera, and they stayed basically the same all this week in all of those 4 cities. And so I thought, well, that's really good. But I keep thinking some of the things that Professor Cooperman and Professor Farnsworth talked about on Tuesday, and I think those are going to be a lot of what we come up with. I hope historians spend a lot of time talking about what the medical scientific field has done. Those are certainly among my heroes right now, what they were able to figure out and what they've had to deal with, because not everything has turned out right. But I will mention that some of the problems they have picked up from some of these vaccines, that's what happens with vaccines. I mean, that's what happens with antibiotics. That's what happens. Not everybody responds well to everything. That's the bigger picture. I do legal constitutional history, but I've avoided that in this because I don't want to deal with issues of federal power versus state versus individual rights. That's really tricky, but I think that's going to be the centerpiece of a lot of the discussion. So.
There could be some amazing stories to tell in the future history books about COVID-19. That's for sure.
A lot of cartoons and videos and all of that.
That's right.
That.
Yeah, of course. Now, interesting, and this has been a continuing discussion. Certainly, the last session earlier this week, we talked a bit about people that were resistant to getting the vaccine. What is really intriguing after your presentation is to see some of the parallels between 1918, people resisting the restrictions, not wanting to wear a mask, not wanting to social distance, and we saw that happening now. But we also saw in the intervening years that people were willing to get the vaccinations, huge lines to get the polio vaccine. We're not seeing that right now. There's more resistance to the vaccination now than we found in other pandemics or epidemics. Is there anything that we can draw from history to explain that?
I mean, I do think the message was so diverse about COVID that I think once some people made up their minds, I don't know anybody that has informed me that they got COVID. So I could simply say, well, then that's all make believe. I think in 1918, it was hard not to know somebody who had influenza, whether it was deadly or not, but getting it was enough to freak people out. But the resistance in 1918, just to go back to that, all of the measures were basically left up to cities and states, and most of it to city health departments and all of that. San Francisco was the one that really said, you've got to wear a mask or you're going to get a fine and you're going to go to jail and you're going to do all of that. So there was a lot of resistance to that. There was a lot of resistance to closing stores, closing theaters, closing saloons, when they did close schools. And we're talking only about, in some cases, 1 to 2 weeks. We're not talking months and months and months. And there was a lot of resistance to that. They were mocking, they were filing lawsuits. They did a lot of what we did. I think we look back and say, well, look at all the people wearing masks, because those are the people who got their pictures taken. I don't think the other people not wearing masks got their pictures taken. So we don't, have the sense. And also the masks back then were probably pretty close to worthless, because they didn't know the teeniness, I guess you'd say, the virus. And they had basically gauze masks. And sometimes it was almost like a upper class lady wore a little kind of net veil. That was her mask. So they were pretty worthless. And my understanding is there's really nothing they could have done to stop influenza back then. But I don't think things have changed. I think polio, just the nature of it targeting children to the degree it did, was enough.
Well, I think we're about out of time. That was really terrific. I appreciate that very much. Fabulous historical perspective on disasters. Really appreciate that. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Claudine Farrell, a professor of history and chair of our Department of History and American Studies. And just a couple reminders for everybody. Next week is our last week of class. We have on Tuesday, the science of COVID, what's next, from one of our faculty in the Department of Biological Sciences. And on Thursday, COVID and communication with our very own Dr. Anand Rao, who will be speaking to us on Thursday. The students, a reminder to log off and join us for the discussion groups. And also please check Canvas for more information about the final paper for the course that is due about a week after the course ends next Thursday. So check Canvas for that information. And we look forward to seeing you all next week for our final class of Life After COVID. Thank you all so much.